U.S. cuts in foreign aid are hitting refugee camps worldwide as the number of refugees continues to be near an all-time high. The UN says about 122 million people are displaced globally, twice as many a decade ago. Along with Syria, Ukraine, Afghanistan, and Myanmar, the conflict in Sudan has created the biggest displacement, more than 14 million people. Fighting between the government and rebels in the Democratic Republic of Congo has displaced more than 7 million. U.S. funding that until recently fed people who had fled Sudan and the DRC has been slashed. DW's Sela Oneko visited a refugee camp in Kenya that is quickly running out of food.
Empty warehouses. That's what we're greeted with at the World Food Programme's food stores in Kenya's Kakuma refugee camp.
This is one of the areas where we keep cereals. It's completely empty.
With warehouse stocks down to 25%, these lentils from the US are some of the last supplies for the entire refugee camp. Since WFP's biggest donor, the US, stopped its funding in February, no more food has arrived.
For the first time ever, in the month of June, WFP was only able to cover 30% of the food requirements for the refugees.
Located in the very arid northern part of Kenya, Kakuma houses over 300,000 refugees from countries like South Sudan, Somalia, and DRC. With not enough food to go around, WFP has had to cut food rations drastically. In August, they say, over a third of the refugees won't get any food at all. Regina Ngole, who fled the war in South Sudan, shows us the food for her family of 7. A few leaves she plucked that day. The rice, oil and lentils she got from WFP for June and July have already run out. Her 2-year-old was admitted to hospital several times with severe malnutrition, which is why a community health worker has come to check on her. She often falls sick. There is no food at the moment and we're living in hunger, because the rations we got are finished. While some refugees have built up businesses or have jobs within the camp, most are dependent on the food rations.
This is the amount of rice and the amount of lentils that were given to one person per day for the months of June and July. Refugees were also given cash transfers or coupons to top up their rations and buy extra food in markets like these. This was, however, stopped, which means that now refugees have less food, no money to spare, and markets like these have less income.
Although the rations will be cut even further next month, those most in need have been promised a small amount of cash. But the cuts can already be felt all around. In the camp's main hospital, more and more children of both the refugees and even the local Kenyan population who live amongst them are being admitted. The lack of food and supplements for mothers and children mean that the children are less resistant to severe cases of malaria, stomach and respiratory infections.
The highest numbers of mortalities that we've recorded was actually in the month of March, that we recorded 15 mortalities in this particular ward. And that's just a pointer to how unawares were caught with the surge in number of patients that we're seeing in this particular ward.
The signs of US funding still adorn every corner of the camp, yet the next few months look bleak.
This is a crisis. It's a slow starvation. And this is where the world really needs to look at this situation carefully and restate funding for the refugee operations in Kenya.
The WFP is hoping for new shipments from other donor countries. But for now, they're preparing to deliver the hard message to the refugees, that there's not enough food for everyone.
Well, earlier, my colleague Terry Martin spoke to Filippo Grandi, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, about the situation in refugee camps and the impact of aid cuts.
Unfortunately, what you heard from this excellent program is very frequent, is widespread. The entire aid system has been hit by a wave of cuts, reductions, suspensions, and freezes. Much reference was made in the report to US cuts, and these are very serious because the US traditionally covered the very large proportion of humanitarian assistance worldwide, but also some European countries are reducing their humanitarian contributions. So all the organizations like mine, like the World Food Programme and others, are impacted. I was in Ethiopia a few days ago where colleagues had to make decisions such as let's discharge from hospital children that have undergone 1 or 2 days of treatment for malnutrition and are beginning to be better, to make space for those who are even more malnourished. But we know very well that discharging people too early is not a solution. So these are really life and death decisions that colleagues have to make because of this dramatic situation with incalculable impact on millions of people.
Hunger is one of many major concerns. What else is being affected by the aid cuts by the U.S. and others?
The most impacted sectors are food security, therefore that is in relation to hunger, of course, but many others as well. Water and sanitation interventions that are so important in crowded spaces, health programs, they have been particularly impacted, but also more specific activities. For example, activities in support of women who have been impacted by violence, which is unfortunately, tragically so frequent in conflict today. Rape has become a regular tool of war and control, and caring for victims has become a very large part of our work. All of this has been decimated from the resource point of view, which means that many women cannot get the care that they deserve and need. And I can give you other examples, but these are some of the most important, significant examples of impact of cuts.
The United States supplied up to 70% of essential aid in refugee camps. Who, if anyone, is able and willing to fill that gap now?
That may be very difficult. I think it is important that there is a better balance of contributions between all countries that can do that. In that sense, I think what the United States has been saying, we need more participants, European countries, countries from the Gulf region that have resources, and countries in other parts of the world. I think it is important to call on everybody to share this responsibility. But my appeal is particularly to European countries. There is another impact that we haven't mentioned of the cuts. And this is something so important in Europe, so sensitive in Europe. I was in Chad a few days ago and I saw assistance decrease for people coming from Sudan. And these people that receive almost nothing when they arrive in Chad, they move on to Libya. And we know what that means, that these people, many of them may try to move to Europe afterwards. So lack of aid also has an effect, an impact on population movements.
To people watching this program from the United States and other countries not directly impacted by the crisis, what's your message?
My message is that I deal with one particular aspect of crisis and of relief operations that demonstrates that such crises are not isolated, cannot be insulated and put aside in the region in which they happen. The movement of people, like I just said, is evidence that they have an impact that goes far beyond the regions where they happen. The war in Sudan, the biggest, which has caused the biggest humanitarian crisis and which is perhaps the most neglected crisis of the world, is proof of that. It can create instability in a vast quadrant of Africa, and as part of the instability, it can create population movements that eventually will also reach rich countries. So nobody is immune from the impact. Besides, of course, the people that are most impacted, who are the refugees and the people in the situation of violence themselves.
You mentioned the potential for migration being a result of the cutbacks in the aid, where people cannot access aid and they'll be seeking new resources. What about conflicts? Do you see the potential for these cuts to global aid programs fueling conflicts in different parts of the world? And which regions are most affected?
There is no doubt, and I've seen it 40 years of work in crisis situation, that when resources decrease, inevitably conflict or the potential for conflict increases. And the cuts in aid are evidence of that. But there are other aspects. There's a lot of talk about the relationship between climate change and conflict, for example. Why? Because climate change deprives entire communities of resources, and those communities more easily are pitched against each other because of the lack of resources. So there is always a correlation between resources and conflict. And besides, the presence of large humanitarian crises makes stability much more of a challenge. People flee from Sudan, to go back to the same example. We think about 4 million Sudanese have left the country since the beginning of the war 2 years ago. Where do they go? They go to countries that are incredibly fragile. They go to Ethiopia, that has just come out of its own civil war. They go to South Sudan, that has gone through a number of civil wars in the last 20 years. They go to Chad, which is one of the 5 poorest countries in the world. You can just imagine the potential for the spread of instability due to this neglect.
Filippo Grandi, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, thank you very much for talking with us today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you very much.